What's up, everybody? Tara Wellman here with a quick series preview for a quick series with the Minnesota Twins. Now, this is the second half of that 2-home, 2-away season series with the Twins, and things didn't go so well in the first half in St. Louis, for the Cardinals at least. The offense scuffled and continued that trend through the Padres series the rest of the week. And just about a week removed from that 2-game sweep, the Cardinals have a chance to go into Minnesota and return the favor. But it's going to take some better offense and some good performances from the likes of Jack Flaherty making his third major league start this season, and the unsung hero of the 2018 Cardinals, Miles Mikolas, taking on familiar foe Lance Lynn. Now, since we just saw the Twins a week ago and heard a lot of things about them and where they stand from Brandon Warren, if you missed it, go back and check that out because some of the information is still very relevant. I decided to bring in my Birds on the Black cohort, Alex Crisafulli, and we wanted to talk more about where the Cardinals are coming into this series and what we can expect, what we look forward to, and also Alex Reyes. Not because it has anything to do with this series, but because he's exciting, and I saw him pitch last night. So without further ado, here's our series preview with a Cardinals twist. So Alex, we just saw this Twins team at the start of what was not a particularly successful week for the Cardinals, losing the 2 to the Twins on the heels of that exciting Cubs series. I don't know about you, but I wasn't particularly surprised that the Cardinals looked a little flat, at least in that first game against the Twins, especially when you look at they were facing Fernando Romero, who is their young stud. It was a John Gant start. There were a lot of issues that made that potentially not a great game, but it doesn't change the fact that the Cardinals can't be particularly happy with how they played against a Twins team that hasn't been all that successful this year.
No, I think they were outscored 13-1 in the two games. So obviously that's not good. But I think people overreacted a little bit. When you talk about a 162 game season, when even very good teams still win less than 60% of their games. You're going to have stretches like that, and you just hope to, they get to play these teams again. You hope that they just can actually I obviously want them to win both games. They should win at least one. But I would say from a big picture standpoint, what they were frustrating with last year, which is losing to teams like the Reds, more than they should. I think they were 10-9 against the Reds last year, which is not great when the Reds were awful and you play them 19 times and you want to beat the awful teams more than that. And then you look at their record against the Cubs, and I think that stat got circulated a lot, which is like the Cubs and Cardinals were like the exact same team if you take out the record against each other, and that was the difference. Well, if you look at where we're at now, which is still very early in the season, the Cardinals are dominating the Reds, and they're playing well against the Cubs. I'm assuming I haven't looked up the stats, but I'm assuming they have a very good record in the division since they are, 11-1 combined against the Reds and the Cubs. And those are things they weren't great at last year. So, the 2-6, the 2-4 stretch, I guess, against the Twins and Padres, that seemed like a good time to, come off that Cubs series, that awesome Cubs series, and maybe create a little more space. But to me, it's also not the end of the world either. I think I just did a very long roundabout way to answer your question, and maybe I didn't even answer. I don't even remember what your question was.
No, I mean, the point I think is that this Cardinals team didn't play very well this week, especially coming off of that series. But you're right. I wasn't quite as horrified, perhaps, about that 2-game set, or even the 2 that they lost in San Diego. I mean, it's frustrating to see them not score, and I think that's the bigger issue than maybe dropping those particular 4 games. So coming into this series with the Twins, the Cardinals, for reference, for context, in the last 7 games, they've scored 16 runs in 7 games, with a, I think, -10 run differential or something like that. So they're being outscored. They're not putting up runs consistently. In the National League, they're ninth in the league with runs scored through the first 6 innings. They're 11th in the league after the 7th inning. Plus, I think one interesting thing.
So they are innings 1 through 6. They are 9th in the NL in scoring.
Yes.
And then 7 on, they are
11th.
First, they're 11th.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Which is interesting because, so that Cubs series, right, there were 2 walk-off wins. The Cardinals have had some walk-offs that make it seem like, cool, these late inning rallies, they come back and score. But similar to perhaps Dexter Fowler in the way that his season has broken down, he has some exciting moments, but overall, it's still not great. So the Cardinals still aren't really scoring late in games particularly well, and I think we've seen a lot of that this last week.
Yeah, you know what, though? And this kind of goes back to the point I was just making a second ago in terms of this season compared to last season. If I recall, last year they were 24 and 29 in one-run games. When they lost that extra innings game to the Padres on, what was that, Saturday night, that went 13, that was their first loss in a one-run game. I think they've won 5 in a row, 5 one-run games in a row. You know, they're like 4-4 in extra innings, which I don't recall what their record was last year, but I believe they had a losing record in extra innings. So, like, you take 24 and 29 last year and you flip that, and they might be in that wild card game. And I don't remember exactly what their record is in one-run games this year, but it's good. They have a winning record, and if they can come out on the good side of those one-run games, which often has to do with nothing more than luck, sometimes it has to do with Matheny doing bad things, but often it's just luck. And so if they can come out on the other side of that, I think they'll be in pretty good shape. That actually surprised me, that stat that they have dropped. They're 11th in scoring, innings 7 through till the end of the game. I'm curious what they are in terms of actually giving up runs, and whether or not they are, because that was the problem last year, right?
Yeah.
I think after 6 innings or 7 innings, they were a very good club, and then from 7th inning on or 8th inning on, they had a. I think, if I recall, the stat was, if you ended a game after the 6th inning last year, meaning like if a game was tied after the 6 innings, I would just go in as a tie. If you were winning, you won that game. I think they were like 12 or 14 games over 500. And we know they ended up being only 4 games over 500. So you can see where a lot of the problems were last year.
Yeah, there was definitely. Well, I mean, if you look at the way that the bullpen shaped up last year, there's been a lot of movement for the Cardinals in that pen this year, but not necessarily in the same way where, you have Sangwano, who's supposed to be your closer, and he can't get anybody out, and then you have Trevor Rosenthal, who gets hurt, and then you have no one who can close games. So they've had a different issue as far as late games, and it may just be the fact that they're not scoring in general. So when you look at what they do 1 through 6, they've mostly got their starter in there who has been successful to this point. Most of their starting pitching has been I think maybe better than some people expected, myself included. Looking at you, Miles Michaelis. But I think the scoring just sort of snowballs, or the lack of scoring snowballs, and then you get into those situations where the bullpen gives up a run, and all of a sudden you're down in the 8th inning, and then they don't come back from that as much as they would need to win some of those close games. But like you said, they're better in that category than they were last year, so I guess we just have to take that for what it is, and maybe not overthink it too much.
You know what I always wonder about this stuff? When you follow baseball, and if you're a fan of one particular team, like we both are, we spend our time with that team, and so like all of my biases are relegated toward that team, and so and maybe it doesn't feel as much like this year because they're not scoring a ton of runs. I think their offense is below average in WRC plus compared to league average compared to the other teams. But it always seemed in past years like it was like, that feast or famine. Like, they're either going to beat a team like 9-1 or they're going to lose 2-1 or something like that. I always wonder if everyone feels that way about their team. And I'd like to see, and one, I don't know if that narrative about the Cardinals the last couple seasons is actually true. I think I actually looked into it one time after 2016, and it kind of was true. But I have no idea how that compares to every other team in the league. And as far as I know, every other fan of every other team is sitting here saying like, this team scores 10 runs one night and then can't score, a single run the next night. You know, why can't we get a hit with runners in scoring? But, there's these little things that are frustrating that seem like they only happen to your team, but I suspect they happen to almost every single team in the league.
Yeah, at one point last year, I was looking at this idea of a shutdown inning, right? And the fact that Cardinals pitchers seemed to have this dramatically evident problem with coming in and putting up a zero after the offense puts runs on the board. So I started looking at it sort of in isolation because that's what we do when we're following one team. And you start to see these numbers and the inability to shut a team down the inning after your offense scores. But then I started comparing it to other teams, and I didn't carry it out through the entire season because it's a lot of spreadsheets, and I just did not have that kind of time. But it was not as dramatically tilted against the Cardinals as you would think it is. So I do think it's one of those things that when you view something sort of in a vacuum, it seems a little bit more exaggerated than it probably really is. But I think that we're seeing that sort of with the way that the results have turned out. The Cardinals still hanging in there at hanging around the top of the division that's so close as it is. But even all these things that are frustrating, the fact that they're not scoring runs, they're still winning a good portion of their games, even if they're not particularly pretty.
Right. And, eventually, and I almost am hesitant to veer into this territory because we know how volatile it's been lately, but like Fowler and Carpenter have to start hitting. And I suspect they will. Or at least I think it's almost any reasonable person would agree that they're going to be better than what they have been. If they can be as good as they both were last year. I think people forget that Fowler, I think, had a 120 WRC plus last year, mostly because he found a power stroke and stuff like that. So I think eventually they will start hitting, but, it kind of needs to happen pretty soon. And, otherwise, I think there are real decisions that Matheny needs to ask himself when filling out a lineup card, like, how much do we need to have these guys in the lineup? And it's kind of a conundrum, which is that, obviously I'm not a baseball player, but I assume, the old adage, the best way to get out of a slump is to just keep taking hacks and eventually it'll happen. But, how long can we stick with that? Can this be an Alan Craig type situation in 2014 where we just keep penciling him into the lineup where he's just absolutely killing us and from a production standpoint in right field to the point that they had to trade him? Obviously, I don't think they're going to force a trade for Carpenter and Fowler, especially I think Fowler has a no trade anyway. But, it's starting to be kind of a weird situation where I really don't know what the answer is. Luckily, they have guys who have come up. This is kind of the Cardinals thing. They've had guys come up and who have performed pretty well, when they're in the lineup, be it Bader, Jose Martinez. It's cooled off a little bit, but he has been somewhat of a surprise, even though I think a lot of people who follow the StatCast stuff tell you that this isn't as much of a surprise as some people think it is. But Fowler and Carpenter need to start hitting. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I think, it's tough because you're right. I do think that a lot of people give Matheny grief for this idea that, we need to let him play to work their way out of it. But you kind of do need to let them play to work their way out of it. It's just a matter of how much of a detriment that is to the rest of the team over someone else who isn't trying to play their way out of a slump. To be clear, I'm definitely not on the side of the spectrum that just says, let's release them all. Just DFA Carpenter and Fowler. That's not a thing that happens. Yeah, no, they don't. I was talking to Daniel Shoptaw on our podcast the other night, and we were like, do people just use DFA as like a text acronym? It's just a thing that they say, and they really have no idea what it means because let's be clear, that's not going to happen with Dexter Fowler or Matt Carpenter.
Well, here's I don't know if you noticed this, but if I recall, was it the Friday night game in San Diego where they just hit a bunch of home runs and
Yeah.
they just the offense went nuts? So neither Fowler nor Carpenter were penciled into that lineup. And of course, you were hearing all this like, look what happens when you throw your best lineup out there. They score runs. Well, guess who also wasn't in the lineup on Sunday? Fowler and Carpenter were not in the starting lineup, if I recall. And guess who all of a sudden wasn't? Did they score 10 runs? No, because that's not how baseball works. Like, I don't know. I'm just so tired of I want them to start hitting just so some people will stop talking about this.
Yeah, yeah. So Dexter Fowler and Matt Carpenter have taken a lot of the heat from the offense, but let's be honest, Marcell Ozuna is not really firing on all cylinders right now either, and neither is Colton Wong. And without Yadier Molina, the catching situation is a bit of a crapshoot right now. And going into the series with the Twins, I mentioned Jack Flaherty getting the start. You would think that the familiarity with Flaherty and Carson Kelly would perhaps be better than a situation where you've got a catcher and a pitcher who don't know each other that well. This Flaherty start, obviously he's making the start in place of Carlos Martinez, which is an issue in of itself, but focusing on Flaherty for a minute, Alex Reyes is coming, and I saw him in person last night in Peoria. He looks great. He's obviously the golden child for that next spot in the rotation. But Jack Flaherty has an opportunity to make another statement about his readiness in the major leagues, doing it against the Twins, who were on a bit of a rise offensively when they came into that last series against the Cardinals. What do you think Jack Flaherty needs to do in this start to sort of reestablish his place in that hierarchy?
Well, I think not give many runners a free base. I think he walks a lot of batters. I think he has I think he has an over 12% walk rate, either here, which isn't a huge sample, or down in Memphis. I can't remember where. And the Twins aren't a good offensive team. I think they have the third or fourth lowest WRC plus as a team in the American League. And if you look at the teams who are behind them, like the Orioles and the Royals, like teams that are set to lose a whole bunch of games, this is this is an offense where you can kind of find your groove against, hopefully. He's been striking out a ton of batters in Memphis. He's kind of like the opposite of Miles Michaelis, right? Like we're getting two pitchers who are at kind of the opposite ends of the spectrum, because Michaelis, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that name.
I don't think anybody does.
I think it's Michaelis, but whatever. He doesn't walk anybody, which is wonderful, but he doesn't. He doesn't strike out a ton of batters, at least as when compared to the era we are currently in. So yeah, just limit the walks. And I feel like this offense doesn't scare me. Talking about the Twins offense, so just don't give those guys free bases. Hope our offense finds something to put 4 or 5 runs on the board, and I think we should be in good shape. Now is Flaherty going against Berrios tonight?
Yes.
And then Lakeland tomorrow night against Flaherty. Against Michaelis, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which are two interesting matchups, I think. If you listen to or watch Kyle Reese on his Prospects After Dark periscopes, he mentioned Berrios last night and was suggesting.
I usually go to bed way before it ends, and when it starts to get just a little past PG-13,
right.
I bail.
I was listening to it on my drive home from Peoria last night and jumped in at just about that point where it was like, this was probably less weird if I'd been here all along. But nonetheless, Here we are. But he was talking about Jose Berrios, and basically suggesting that it won't be surprising if he has a really strong night against the Cardinals. Now, he has struggled in his last, I would say, 4 starts, given up 4 or 5 runs, but he also has a complete game shutout on the year, so I feel like he's a bit of a wild card as far as what the Cardinals can expect from him.
Well, I think he doesn't walk many batters, if I recall, and pretty much across the board elsewhere, he's pretty average. And I mean that in a good way. He it doesn't seem to have like a ton of weaknesses. Maybe he has like a high home run per fly ball rate, I think I saw, but I think that's on like 6 or 7 total home runs. So we're not talking about necessarily a ton so far. So yeah, he's a solid pitcher. I haven't looked at their rotation as a whole, but it wouldn't surprise me if he is their best pitcher from a F WAR standpoint or whatever WAR you want to use. Because I think he's thrown the most innings as well. I want to back up a little bit because, I said their offense doesn't scare me, talking about the Twins offense. But I think another thing to consider is something we've talked about with Fowler and Carpenter, which is that, Byron Buxton was hurt and he's back now, but he's just been awful. I think in like 55 or 60 plate appearances, he has like a 20 WRC plus. Brian Dozier has, I think, been I think he's hitting close to league average right now, which, past years he's been around a 120 WRC plus hitter. I think he hit like 42. I almost forget, because I was looking at his stats last night, like, oh my gosh, he hit 42 home runs in 2016. And then I remembered that. Do you remember around Christmas time before 2017 season when there was like rumblings, like maybe Wong was going to be traded?
Yes, that's right.
And stuff like that. And it was right after like the team had also made these comments about like that they were like committed to Wong and stuff. And it was just a very weird, but
so
also
the usual with Colton.
Yeah, situation, right? Where like this stupid drama that seems completely unnecessary in terms of like from a communication standpoint with the front office and the players plays out in the Post Dispatch. And again, this could be something that happens to every team, and I just don't notice it because I'm following this team. But yeah, what seemed like a very Cardinals thing. But anyway, my point is, like, as far as I know, this Twins offense could be ready to bust out at least to the point that they are capable. So maybe I shouldn't be so, relying on the fact that so far they haven't been that good.
The Cardinals have been known a time or two to help a team break out of a slump. So it wouldn't be shocking. But the second game of the series, Miles Mikolas against Lance Lynn, is fascinating to me for a number of reasons. One, because I just love Lance Lynn, and I think that any chance that there is to mostly hear him in interviews more than watching him pitch is going to be a good time. But it is interesting to see these two matched up directly because essentially the Cardinals swapped Lance Lynn for Miles Mikolas, and seemingly that was the better choice for the way that they've both performed so far this season.
Right. That was another kind of controversial talking point this offseason, which is like, and this was before we knew how good Mikolas was going to be, at least up to this point, which is like, why we have these proven starters on the sideline, be it Lance Lynn, Alex Cobb, Darvish, although there was never much of they never seemed to get in the Darvish race all that much. Why are we relying on a staff that feels like a great big unknown when we have a guy like Lance Lynn there? And now we are kind of seeing, I think, and to be fair, there were a lot of people also saying, no, like look at Lance's peripheral stats from 2017, and the arrow's pointing down here. I don't know how burned he felt by the Cardinals to the point of would he not even still accept that qualifying offer, even though he got, I think, way less in Minnesota, if I recall. I don't remember the exact figure. But his walk rate has increased a ton and has gone up every year the last 4 years. And yeah, that might not seem like a big deal because, the walk rate is pretty high across the league, but he is at like near 16%. And I think only Lucas Giolito, who we also saw, I guess last week or 2 weeks ago, is the only person who's thrown at least 30 innings who's walking more batters than Lance Lynn is right now. And it kind of pains me to say it because I love Lance Lynn, but I'm also not that upset that he's not pitching for the Cardinals this season.
you mentioned you don't know how burned Lance Lynn might have felt. I will be curious to see how he goes out against his former team. It seems like he's not the kind of guy that's going to make a big deal about it either way. But I would imagine that he's going to be anxious to put up probably his best start of the season against the Cardinals. But that could also, the way that Lance Lynn pitches, if he's trying too hard, if he's trying to overthrow it, if he's trying to be too accurate, that could be problematic for him.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I loved about Lance Lynn, is that, I think a lot of people love like pitchers who are like, oh, this guy's cool as a cucumber, he doesn't get rattled. Like when Lance was pissed, you knew it, like he was like stomping around the mound. Like sometimes even before like his delivery hit the catcher's mitt, I could already like see him scowling, so I don't know his mental makeup enough to know whether or not like he pitches better or worse when he's mad, or if it doesn't matter at all, or if he has something to prove, if that's actually going to do anything. But from an entertainment standpoint, he was always fun to watch because he wasn't just this kind of like slab of concrete, like that never moved or something. He was always very animated out there. So yeah, there's a part of me that hopes if we had to lose one of these games that he would throw like 7 or 8 solid innings, and that would be the game we lose. Obviously, I hope we win both, but I don't know. I was kind of hoping he would get a start in St. Louis so he could get a hand that he deserves. I think I did read that they showed him on a video board or something, and he got a decent applause. And that's good because there were always, at least it seemed this way. I think Twitter has kind of warped my brain to, I don't know how much what's real and what isn't, but there always seemed to be a segment of people who never appreciated him enough. Who always thought he was like the head case before Jaime Garcia was a head case, and now I guess Carlos Martinez, if he looks, not 100% like an ace, is the head. I don't know, but there was definitely a contingent that felt that way about Lance Lynn, and so I was glad and that was stupid. He threw like, I don't know, 2012 through 2015, he threw probably on average close to 200 innings every season. And that's not trivial at all. That's something, any team would want from a starting pitcher. So I was glad he got a hand. I hope we rough him up on tomorrow, but if we do have to lose one game, let it be that game.
Full disclosure, I was not Lance Lynn's biggest fan at the beginning of that time period, but it was a situation where I just felt like there were specific things that he needed to continue to develop, and he did. He became progressively better, really, until the injury became an issue, and he missed a season. And if you listen to many of his post-game interviews, it won't be long before he he changes your mind just for the entertainment value, like you mentioned. But going up against Miles Michaelis, and I just sort of want to talk about him for a minute because I think he's kind of catching the attention of Major League Baseball as a bit of a surprise. I think it's surprising people that he can reach back and hit 98 if he needs to, but he's also surprising people by his consistency. And as someone who was not particularly inspired by the move to bring Miles Michaelis into this rotation, I've been extremely impressed to the point where, I look forward to Michaelis starts now, which is not something I expected to be saying, especially at this point in the season.
Sure. I was more or less agnostic on the signing, just because I really didn't know much about him. Although the fact that he seemed pretty coveted by several teams made me think like, okay, we might have something here. Yeah, I mean, he's been great. I'm sure some stats say he's due for some regression, but I think he has to be leading the league in walk rate. I think it's under 2%. He's walked like I think 3 total batters all season. One stat I saw interesting is that I think he's allowed 14 runs all season, whether earned or unearned, who knows. But he's also given up 6 home runs, and that seems to be the thing. Like he goes 7 innings, gives up 1 or 2 runs, and it's usually on like a pitch that, whatever, maybe not have been his best pitch of the night, and someone put it in the seats. So he has, teams aren't immune from hitting home runs off of him. But other than that, he's been just like brilliant. It's great to watch, and the fact that he hit that home run in his first start. That was his first start, right? In hockey.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Oh, first start. Okay, yeah. So no, he's been wonderful, and it's like you think of where. Because right now the back of the rotation is kind of like who is our number 5 starter? Like no one knows. If he hadn't panned out, and credit to the front office that they seemed pretty confident in this guy to the point that they weren't even really chasing other starting pitchers. If he hadn't panned out, it makes me wonder where this rotation would be right now. I guess the Cardinals are kind of one of the teams who can absorb a problem like that because they have all these much talked about great players, great prospects. In Memphis right now, Alex Reyes. As soon as the 60-day DL is over, he has a chance to come up. And if last night was an indicator in Peoria, he could be great as well. But yeah. That does little good, April 1st through May 15th, when the games count as well, and you need to win those games. So, NICOLAI has been outstanding.
You mentioned Alex Reyes. It has nothing to do with the Twins series, but let's talk about Alex Reyes for a minute, because I did get to see him in Peoria last night. He was spectacular. He's pitching against a lineup that he should look completely dominant against, but he did not disappoint. There were audible gasps multiple times on strikeout pitches because there was just that much movement. There was that much variation between a 99-mile-an-hour fastball at the knees and an 82-mile-an-hour breaking ball off the plate. It was spectacular to see him, and I think I know that the Cardinals have been pretty coy about where they see him fitting in, but I don't know. I with the Adam Wainwright situation, with Carlos Martinez at least missing this one start, it's got to feel like Alex Reyes has a pretty clear path to a starting rotation job with the Cardinals.
Yeah, we know that starting rotation 1 through 5 is pretty fluid, especially when you get to June and July and injuries and, dead arms, whatever, start, popping up. So it certainly seems, and believe me, this is just me parroting things I've read from other people. I'm not like a prospects person, but it certainly seems like he's being groomed to be a starting pitcher, and that's good because I think the last thing we wanted was him to be kind of pigeonholed as like a relief pitcher, or and then like I don't know, a situation comes up where it's just like can we just get this guy out of the bullpen and into the starting rotation. And that has me really excited, especially just from a standpoint of anytime a guy has Tommy John surgery. And believe me, we aren't there yet at all. But anytime a guy misses a whole season for Tommy John like that young, you just never know how they're going to come back. And a part of me was worried, like, like we may have just missed on this guy. And that happens with these sort of injuries. So, if he could come up and be like that electric pitcher that, you've been reading about in Baseball America and Prospectus for all these years, man, not only would that be great just from a rotation standpoint, but just from like an excitement of every 5 days we get to watch this guy pitch. That is something that's great. Yeah. Especially like, baseball's is a very long season, and we're lucky in that it's been a really long time since the Cardinals have had one of those teams that's been out of it in June. Most people probably can't remember that time, but that happens, and sooner or later it's probably going to happen to the Cardinals again. And the way to get through a season like that is you have a guy like Alex Reyes you can look forward to every 5 days. So that's the great thing about Alex Reyes is not only does he make your team better, but when your team is bad, he makes them worth watching, at least every once in a while.
Yeah, I remember talking to, two things. First of all, when Alex Reyes came up at the end of the year when he first made his Major League debut, I remember thinking that because it was not It was not a great year up until that point. And I remember thinking, man, this is a thing that, if nothing else, fans are going to be really excited to see if he's as good as advertised. And they're going to want to watch these games. I want to watch these games where Alex Reyes is pitching, not because I'm particularly concerned about the result, but because I want to see Alex Reyes pitch. So I think he brings that to the team, to the organization, to the field every time he's out there. I think we saw a little bit of that with the reaction to his rehab start last night. But then I also remember early in the season, actually it was the very first series of the year with the Mets. In doing that preview, we were talking a little bit about Matt Harvey before the Matt Harvey drama escalated very quickly. But the point was made there that it was hard for Mets fans to kind of let go of Matt Harvey because he'd been that guy. When the Mets were really bad, Matt Harvey was still really good. And every 5 days, you still wanted to watch that team because it was Matt Harvey day.
Right. Absolutely. And, I feel like I should probably give a mention to Carlos Martinez, too. It's not fair to leave him out of that discussion because, he hasn't been like Greg Maddux or like Pedro Martinez, but he's been pretty close to being a guy you get excited about every 5 days to get the ball. So, we have had Carlos. And if you add Reyes to that equation, then this is going to be a fun team. So I just hope it, I just want it to work out.
Yeah.
We're due for a break from, that would probably make fans of other fan bases roll their eyes. But I feel like we're due for a break of having just a guy come up and just be exciting and, level, which again is really projecting a lot for a guy coming off Tommy John who's pitching in, Peoria last night. But I don't care. That's where I want this to go. So I'm setting my hopes pretty high.
And he was asked about that after the game last night too. Just sort of how he takes the fact that there are these great expectations for him, and knowing that he's coming off of an injury, knowing that there are still some unknowns. And he basically was like, no, it's cool that the fans are excited to see me. I'm not going to overthink that, but I'm as excited to get there as they are to see me there. So hopefully it all works out.
I have a question, and maybe that you couldn't tell just from being there one night or anything. And I haven't looked at his stat line other than I saw he struck out 12 batters. Isn't that right? He struck out 12? Yeah. If he had a problem when he was up, it's that, he walked guys. He had trouble with his command sometimes. Did he look fine from that standpoint? Is there I should be following this more closely than I am, but what's the word on that? Has he solved that at all? Or is that still just kind of like, hey, not everyone's perfect, and look, this guy's pretty awesome. He's going to have one little thing that might kind of annoy you a little bit, but you'll get over it because he does all these other great things.
For the most part, it was really good. He was really solid. He was attacking the strike zone most of the night. He walked 2 guys last night, and in both of those at-bats, he fell behind early. If I remember correctly, in both cases, he tried to get a strike on the inside corner of the plate to start, and then tried to go outside and missed on both sides of the plate. In both of those at bats. And so once he got to that point, he wasn't quite able to reel it back in and get the strikeout. But immediately following both of those walks, he struck out the next guy on like 4 pitches. So there were those 2 little instances where it was evident that he was trying to find the edge of the plate and wasn't quite there, but he was able to correct it relatively quickly in whatever his approach was to the next batter. So I don't know if that was intentional. I don't know if he was working on that command and there were just those 2 little blips on the radar, but over the course of a night, I'll certainly take that. And it looked like it was never a situation where his mechanics got out of whack or he just had no idea where the ball was going. It was just those 2 little instances where he fell behind and then wasn't able to backtrack, but seemed to rectify it very quickly with the next batter.
Okay, I guess the only reason why that worries me is he strikes out a lot of batters, and if you're doing that and also walking a lot of batters, you're putting in a lot of work. You're throwing a lot of pitches versus that's a lot of labor versus a guy like I don't know, Miles Michaelis, who pitches more to contact and gets, a lot more outs on 1 or 2 pitches, per at bat. So I don't know. I think that's the only thing that worries me about him is that, that's a lot of just stress on the arm if you're striking out a lot of batters, but also walking a lot of batters. But yeah, I couldn't be more excited for him.
And he, it was interesting hearing him after the game because by all accounts, it was a very successful outing for him and impressive in many ways. But the first thing he was asked was essentially, what did you think about your outing tonight? And he kind of hesitated, and he was very hesitant to say, yeah, I felt really good. It was a really strong outing. I really feel good about where my pitches were. And the first thing he said was, there's still some things to work on. I fell behind some batters, and you could see him sort of recounting it, and he said, well, I faced 18 hitters, and I think got first pitch strikes on 9 of them. So I really want to work on getting a first pitch strike more often. So he's there. He knows what he's looking at and where he needs to make those improvements, which I thought was impressive coming off of just a rehab start where the biggest concern is how his arm feels, not necessarily how many first pitch strikes there were.
Right. No, that's interesting.
So, like I said, Alex Reyes has nothing to do with the Twins series this week, but it seemed relevant based on what we saw last night, and of course, based on what we're going to be seeing as the Cardinals try to figure out what to do with Adam Wainwright. Anything else about this Twins series that stands out to you as far as the Cardinals are concerned, or where the Twins might be at in trying to continue their success against the Cardinals?
Well, the AL Central is bad. I think that Twins are in second place, and they're I think 2 games under 500, and have like a 15% chance of making the playoffs because they get to play a lot of worse teams like the Royals and the White Sox. But not so relevant to this series in general. But I always want to beat the Twins because the first baseball season I really followed was 1987. And even without Jack Clark, who was banged up for that series, we were better than the Twins. People always talk about the 2006 Cardinals who won the World Series and only won 83 games. Well, the 87 Twins only won 85 games, and they had a negative 20 run differential. They were outscored by the rest of the league during the season. I don't know if that's ever happened for a World Series winner. I believe at least the 2006 Cardinals were at least like 20, I think 20 plus runs on the year, which, isn't great either. But, I was like 8 years old. I was like, okay, this is like perfect. My team's the best. It's going to be like this every year. And then they lose to the Twins in that stupid white roof Metrodome where, I might be exaggerating this a little bit, but I feel like our players couldn't even see the ball coming down from the sky because they weren't used to playing there. And Jack Clark's hurt. The most memorable moment came from Tom Lawless hitting the home run and flipping the bat. So I always want to beat these guys just because I feel like we owe it to them for 87. Not that they're like an evil franchise. They're anything but. They're a very likable franchise, and they've had a lot of likable players. I enjoy their fans, but yeah,
But those childhood memories, they don't go away.
So it was really bad because Game 7, it was a school night, if I recall, and I had to go to bed. I was like 8 years old, and so I had to go to bed, and my parents woke me up in the middle of the night, or not in the middle of the night, but when they were going to bed, to tell me that the Cardinals lost. And I was the only Cardinals fan in my household, so I was the only one who had a strong, I was the only person vested in this news. And I woke up the next morning and I thought to myself, maybe that was a dream and didn't happen, that conversation. Maybe my parents never came in. I went and sought them out and they're like, no, they lost. Yeah, it's over. And so I had to find out twice, the Cardinals lost the World Series, and I think I was crying or something. I don't know.
Oh, man. Yeah, no, that's a fair reason to always want to beat the Twins. I just hope they beat the Twins because I don't really want to hear about it on Twitter for the next, 3 months about how they got swept by the Twins. That's sort of my selfish reason for wanting them to play well this weekend. But also, just this offense really needs to find itself, and if it's going to happen, it should start to happen against teams that don't have the best pitching to offer, so that then when they are playing teams in the division or the teams they're going to have to keep up with in order to make a postseason run, they're not trying to find it against those guys who stifle good teams offensively.
I think you're absolutely right. Like, with so many bad teams, come the end of the year, what might separate teams like the Cardinals and the Brewers and the Cubs might be, and maybe I'm giving the Brewers too much credit here, who knows, but it might be how they did against these bad teams, because there's so many of them. And so if, one team plays like just barely over 500 against them, or one team just like mashes them like they should, that could end up being the difference. So yeah, I don't want to say these games don't matter at all, because I think anything but. So it would be nice to beat the Twins like we should have in '87. There
you go. Exactly. Yeah. It all comes full circle. Yeah. Well, Alex, I don't want to take up any more of your time, but this was a different twist on the series preview, focusing more on the Cardinals. But there were just so many things Cardinal specific that I felt like we needed to talk about. So I appreciate your time this morning.
No, this was fun. Thanks for having me.
As you can see, there was much to talk about as far as the Cardinals go right now. Heading into this series, heading into the homestand, coming off of the West Coast trip that was, mildly unsuccessful. Look, this is a confusing team right now in a lot of ways, because they're winning more games than they lose, and that's what you want. But they also have some really troubling trends that need to be rectified sooner rather than later if they want to stay in that conversation as far as one of the better teams in the division. It's going to be a battle all season. I get that, and I'm certainly not suggesting that you solve these issues by just completely flipping the roster, trading teams with Memphis for a while and seeing what happens. That's not how you fix what's going on with the Cardinals right now, particularly offensively. How you fix it is you just gotta get some guys going. And if I knew how to make that happen, I'd be working for the Cardinals, not doing series previews for you. But nonetheless, hopefully it's a good series with the Twins, and hopefully it's a great homestand with the Phillies and the Royals coming up next. I will see you then for another series preview, and as always, you can follow me on Twitter for more.